I'd like to welcome back our audience to a reconvening of the conversation which I have been holding with Phil Curry of Shoreline Partners on some important aspects of the merger and acquisition process. Thanks for joining us, Phil.
Thank you for having me.
We've now, Shoreline Partners has been successful in generating interest from a substantial number of apparently viable prospective buyers. You've got 6, 8, 10 prospects breathing hard at the prospect of acquiring your client. How do you go about handling that process from that point on to maximize the seller's fortunes on this?
We believe that the auction process, and that's what we're talking about, is the competitive environment for our client is the most prosperous 90 days in the history of this company. When you have companies or buyers that are bidding to buy this company, some of them want them for strategically offensive purposes, but others want to buy them because they do not want their competitors to own them. They don't know who is the participant in this auction. And
it could be their stiffest competitor, for
yes,
example.
And
yep.
Sometimes they believe they're there and they're not. But they do not know that.
Yeah.
So
keep that strictly confidential.
It's strictly confidential who the parties are. And when these offers come in, they are all very, very different. And they're usually in the forms of a letter of intent, non-binding, but it is their bid process. And as we assemble these, we go back to each one of these and we tell them whether they're competitive or not. And they want to know that. We do not identify a price value for our clients. We believe that basically sets a ceiling.
At no point during this process, either in your marketing materials or in the process of engaging in the auction, are you saying we think this company is worth X? You let them set the price.
We have that discussion with our client, but we don't see any value in giving that to a buyer other than creating a ceiling, which we've exceeded so many times that I'd hate to have them, a buyer who doesn't want to pay more than the seller thinks it's worth. So when you do that, there's really no gain in that for you. So what we do is we play one buyer against the other. And in doing so, quite often it may not be just as much as the dollar amounts as it is the type of currency or the terms or how they're going to treat the employees going forward or the investment they have to make this company going forward.
Now, the type of currency, you're talking about the methods of payment of the price.
That's right. Whether they want to buy it with notes, whether they want to buy it with their public stock, or whether they want to buy it with their private stock. It all is different. When these bids are all coming in, and we take them to the breaking point, we usually end up with 2 or 3 right at the top. And we sit down with our client, and they evaluate them. We go through, we look at basically the economic value of each, and also the aesthetic value of how they're going to run this business. This business is this client's baby. They have built this business and they want it handed over to someone, in most cases, who is going to take good care of it and take it to the level that they may not have ever envisioned. They also want their people taken care of. Oftentimes, our clients do not take the highest economic offer.
I've always felt also, Phil, that it's important during this period for the seller to gain some comfort regarding the integrity of the buyer, because as the process evolves, that seller and the investment banker have to have a confidence that that buyer that they ultimately settle on is going to be reliable and is not going to try to, as we put it, work them excessively during the ensuing negotiation process, and particularly after the closing. So many times I've seen situations where after the closing, a buyer can generate excessive demands for recovery of some of the funds that he's paid. So that development of that trust at that stage is a factor that has to be paid attention to. Let's assume here you've worked this process down to the point where, as you say, you're down to the final 2 or 3 bidders, and then you alight on one of them as being the most likely candidate. How do you go from there?
Well, we've gone into a very critical. You just mentioned a very interesting point, and that is the reason you have a competitive environment. First of all, is to know what the company's worth. You can do appraisals all day long, but you really do not know. In a competitive environment, now you know what it's worth to the buyers. There's quite a gap between what it's worth to the seller and what it's worth to the buyer, particularly a strategic buyer who you believe can do more with it than the seller could. So you have established the value that you think it's going to be sold at, and you now are evaluating the letters of intent. You now have a competitive environment to continue throughout the due diligence process, because the selected or successful buyer that you select at this point, and now you're going to enter in one of the most perilous times in the transaction, which is basically the due diligence process. But the buyer now knows that you have a backup offer, because we go to all of the unaccepted offers, and we tell them that we have not selected them as the buyer. However, in due diligence process, as perilous as it is, you know something could happen. So we'd like to have them on a standby, and we will bring them to the table in the event that that occurs. Now, the successful bidder also knows the same thing. Mm-hmm. So their behavior during negotiations of due diligence and the definitive agreement, if done in an expedient manner, which we try to manage very effectively with the attorneys involved, really put us in a very competitive, strong bargaining position to prevail in issues that they will bring up, whether it be in recasting or their customer base that they believe might be perilous or whatever it might be.
You're speaking of an area that I think is fundamental to maximizing the value that a seller is ultimately going to generate from a sale, and that is all of the different steps that can be taken to prevent from the slow seeping of bargaining power and erosion of your bargaining power during the process. Number one, you've raised the fact the process has to be done with dispatch. It has to be done promptly. There's no value to be derived by a prolonged process as far as the seller is concerned, in my opinion. Secondly, you have to maintain your bargaining power by a competitive process. If the buyer thinks that he's the only kid on the block that has an interest in your company, you're extremely vulnerable. This is why in some situations, and I think you and I have discussed this, where you have a buyer that initiates the process by approaching your seller or your client with an interest to purchase their company, that you're at somewhat of a disadvantage because by the very nature of that process, there are no competitors. The buyer has initiated the process. You've been in those situations, and I think even in those situations, you've tried to create a competitive environment, as I understand it.
Oftentimes, the triggering event is that someone attractive to the business owner has come along and said that they want to acquire them. Yeah. And the timing is just right, or whatever, so that the client said, "I'm never having sold a business before, will engage an investment banker and come to us, and they'll ask us to get the deal done with their new best friend." Yeah. And we discuss this with our client, and our strategy here is to go ahead and prepare. We need to know the due diligence and all of the issues with this client, and we'll write a book in any case, so that this buyer, who is the anointed buyer, so to speak, by the seller, knows that we can always go get a competitive offer or another offer, and we're prepared to do so in the event that they do not behave themselves effectively.
Right.
So it's a, but you're absolutely correct. With one buyer, you can't control the timing, you can't control the negotiations, you really do not have much control over the process, and they will wear you down, as you know. You've seen this now over and over. And so competition is the key.
Phil, as we continue to mine the information that you have provided us here, which is so invaluable, we're going to have to take another break and reconvene at a later point in time, because I want to capture all of this information for our viewing audience.